Bullseye with Jesse Thorn is a production of MaximumFun.org and is distributed by NPR.
It's Bullseye. My guest this week is Aviva Kempner. She's the director of the documentary The Spy Behind Home Plate. The film follows the life of Moe Berg. Moe played back in the 1920s and 1930s, the era of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. And even though he's not a household name these days like those guys are, he's maybe 1,000,000 times more interesting. He was known at the time as the brainiest man in baseball. He studied Sanskrit at the Sorbonne in Paris, and once he left baseball, he became a spy during World War II. Here's a scene from the documentary. Robert Fitz, the author of Bonsai Babe Ruth, shares the time Moe and Babe Ruth went on a barnstorming trip through Japan.
Moe Berg spent most of his time on deck in a deck chair studying Japanese. At the very beginning of the trip, Babe Ruth goes up to Moe Berg and he says, "Do you speak Japanese?" Moe Berg says, No, I don't really speak Japanese at all. And they arrive 2 weeks later in Yokohama, and a Japanese man comes on board, and Berg greets him in what sounds to Babe Ruth like perfect Japanese. And the Babe looks at Moe and says, "I thought you said you can't speak Japanese." And Berg looks at him and goes, "Well, that was 2 weeks ago."
Aviva, welcome to Bullseye. It's nice to have you on the show, and thank you for the film.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So you have kind of dedicated your career to telling the stories in film of Jewish heroes. Why is that?
Underknown Jewish heroes. Well, it started out because as a child of a Holocaust survivor, I was always fascinated with the fact that people didn't know that Jews had fought back in the resistance. And I thought it was unfair that people didn't know it. And because of career choices, I always thank the D.C. bar for flunking me. I was in law school. I decided to go the avenue of pursuing film, and that was the first story on the agenda. I produced it and conceived it. And from there, it had to do with other heroes that I had heard about. You know, Hank Greenberg was this great baseball player, almost broke Babe Ruth's record in 38. Didn't play on Yom Kippur in 34, which was a big thing at the height of domestic anti-Semitism in Detroit. And my dad, who was an immigrant Jew who loved baseball and taught my brother and I baseball, always talked about it. I thought he was part of Kol Nidre service, which is our most religious service growing up. And then it just kept on going. Gertrude Berg started the first sitcom, fought on TV, fought sexism and McCarthyism. And then I was inspired by Julian Bond to make a film on Julius Rosenwald, the great philanthropist who gave away $62 million in his life and built in tandem with African-American communities 5,000 schools in the Jim Crow South. So it has continued to be a theme. And, I feel especially even in dramatic films or in TV, there's not enough, I think, positive Jewish characters. And as I say, they call me the Jewish Spike Lee, and I just keep on rolling with it.
What do you think is the particular connection between Jews in the United States and baseball?
I don't think we're the only immigrant group, but what I could have observed from my father is when he came, now of course he came in the 20s, baseball was the only sport, but I think in general it's been written about that immigrants, when they come here, how do you adapt to America? And one easy way was to follow baseball. And I think that's just continued. I mean, maybe now today's it's football or basketball, but it certainly was in my dad's day, and he conveyed it to us. We went to a lot of games growing up. I continue it, although I tease my brother Jonathan, "You've betrayed us because you're following hockey and basketball." But I think it was a pretty accessible game for a lot of people. And again, it was what others do. I mean, it's how you became American. Although the interesting thing about Moe Berg, his father was an immigrant Jew, had come from the Ukraine, worked his way up from working in a sweatshop to training as a pharmacist. His son played baseball as a young boy, a star on the Princeton team, 15 years in the major leagues, 2 years as a coach, and Bernard Berg never saw his son play one game. I mean, to me, that's the tragedy of Moe's life.
Well, I mean, I think that is probably not an uncommon experience among the children of immigrants who go into what you might broadly characterize as the impractical fields, right?
Well, actually, during the Depression, Moe was making a better living, than his siblings or his dad. And I might say, I think it also hurt Bernard a lot, in all fairness, because Moe, in the winter, had gone to law school for 3 seasons. Even the first season, he was playing for Chicago White Sox, coming late for spring training. Although the second season, the owner, Kaminsky, said, you can't come late. So he got excused from Columbia Law School to finish the course later. But I think you're right. I think it's not the typical avenue. I mean, here's a new country, and, why do our kids want to play sports? That's not something really respected back in the old country.
So Moe Berg was an extraordinarily successful student, and he went off to an Ivy League college. At the time, the Ivy League and many American colleges, most American colleges, still had significant limits for Jewish students. What were the limits and challenges that he faced, even as a star athlete?
So Moe's on the team in 23, and we show in the film his yearbook picture, and under it they call him Hebrew. So that was partly the identification right there. But it was more than that. I don't quite get it, but Princeton has this program, and maybe it even exists today, of dinner clubs, and that you belong to certain dinner clubs. Well, apparently Jewish students couldn't get into them, but because Moe was a star on the baseball team, Moe wasn't invited to be in a dinner club. But they told him he couldn't bring any other, especially other Jewish students, his fellow students, and Moe just refused to join it. So that's the one scene that I have in the film that I really identified that Moe faced anti-Semitism. It was much more pronounced for Hank Greenberg even a decade later, but of course they didn't want him to hit home runs against him, so there was a lot of catcalling from opposing teams in the field.
So he was a star player on the baseball team. Was it clear that he was going to become a professional baseball player?
Well, I think in his mind, it was very clear. He was really good. People were scouting him. There's a really fun story, and this is the advantage of being a child of immigrants and being exposed to languages. Plus, he majored in linguistics at Princeton, is they used to tell each other signals secretly in Latin, although in the film there's a very funny line. Well, you're playing other Ivy League schools. They know Latin, too. So what do? You say your signals in Sanskrit. Although I think Sanskrit's a written language, so that would be difficult, too.
One of Moe Berg's teammates at one point was talking about him, and he said, Berg, he speaks a dozen languages and can't hit in any of them, which is very funny and also isn't true.
There is some doubts that he spoke all 12 fluently. He probably spoke 10.
He spoke English, French, Spanish, German.
His Greek was perfect.
Hebrew, Russian.
His Latin was quite good.
Sanskrit, and he also spoke Yiddish.
So he was initially scouted and signed by teams in cities with big Jewish populations who wanted him because they saw the opportunity to have a ball player who was also a box office star to those immigrant communities.
But only the first time was the Brooklyn Robins. After that, he went to Chicago and then Washington and Cleveland, then ended up in Boston. But I think the first intention was that, too. Just like with Hank Greenberg, the New York teams were going after him. Or I'd say the Yankees were, and Hank took one look at Lou Gehrig and say, I'm never going to play first base.
So the first thing we are going to hear is from Robert Matthews, who's a baseball memorabilia collector. And he's talking about the two things that Moe Berg brought with him on a trip to Japan, a Major League Baseball tour of Japan. The first was a Bell & Howell movie camera, which was a big deal at the time, and one other thing.
But he also had a letter with him that was signed by Secretary of State Cordell Hull. It was addressed to the embassy in Japan to extend all sorts of diplomatic courtesy to Moe.
Why would Moe Berg have a letter from Secretary of State? Was it because he knew to have this in case he ever ran into any trouble, in case he wanted any favors? Or was there an ulterior motive? Was he already spying for the United States government?
Who knows what it's going to be like in the future? And that's why Hull gave him the letter, because the State Department wants to know about what's going on. And they figure a baseball player is going to find out unique, interesting things.
Now, here's the thing. There are some things about Moe Berg's baseball career that are, in your local library's copy of the Baseball Encyclopedia, that are hard facts. The rest of his life is so extraordinary that as many times as I've heard about it, I've always just thought that can't possibly be true.
You couldn't make it up.
It's too good a story. It's too good a story. This has to be apocryphal. It just has to be that he coincidentally spoke a bunch of languages and read the newspaper a lot. Like, this couldn't be true. So when you're making a film about this, how did you get to the part of the story that you knew was true, separate from the he spoke 12 languages and he couldn't hit in any of them things that, everyone who's ever read a, biographical encyclopedia of baseball knows about Moe Berg?
Well, I had the advantage of several things. There were 2 books written by Moe, and the second was the one that we used the most, called The Catcher Was a Spy by Nicholas Davidoff, and he's in the film. The second one was these 18 interviews recorded 30 years ago by the people who really experienced him either day by day on the field or were on the most secret missions with Moe, as well as 2 ESPN interviews that had been taken for a short doc that had been done on Moe. We also had declassified OSS records, and that was very important. But 4 of the people in my film themselves were trying to make a film on Moe. Robert Kaplan, who years ago had gotten the option of the first book on Moe after Marlon Brando's option ran out. Ray Fox, who had been commissioned by Harvey Weinstein before we knew how evil Harvey was, had written a script on Moe. A woman with my same first name, Aviva Miller, who had got to know Sam Berg and was trying to make a film on Moe. And then this Neil Goldstein, who actually was just in the excerpt you played, who conducted those interviews. So partly it's from the people who worked with him, played with him, and the conjecture of all these other people that were trying to make films, including Larry Merchant, who is a boxing specialist and announcer. And it turns out, after a while, myself and my editor, who I think does a beautiful job in the film, Barbara Bello, we just started putting together the pieces and saying, some is still open, but some seems very clear, because we had the OSS, the woman, Sue Strange, who does the research on OSS. And again, because the documents were declassified, it really helped.
I'll continue my conversation with Aviva Kempner in a minute. Stay with us. It's Bullseye from MaximumFun.org and NPR. Support for this podcast and the following message comes from Babbel. Have you always wanted to speak a new language? Whether it's for travel, work, or brain training, Babbel's 10 to 15-minute lessons will get you speaking confidently in your new language. Choose from Spanish, French, and more. You'll learn through real-life dialogues, speech recognition, and interactive trainers. And Babbel's spaced repetition method actually makes you remember what you've learned. Download the app or go to Babbel, BABBEL.com, to try Babbel for free.
Americans kind of owe recycling to the mafia, and a huge mistake by this guy.
Garbage in New York, that was like a controlled substance. There was a cartel that controlled the flow of garbage.
Why we started recycling on NPR's Planet Money podcast.
Hey, I'm Janet Varney, and like many of you, some more recent than others, I used to be a teenager. In fact, just about all of my friends were too, including wonderful women like Allison Brie.
I'm dead center on the balance beam. And this is like a big gym. All the kids' parents are there watching. I have to stop, like, when you have to pee so bad and you can't even move. And then I just go. I just pee right in the middle of the high balance beam.
So join me every week on the JV Club podcast, where I speak with complicated, funny, messy humans as we reminisce about our adolescences and how they led us to becoming who we are. Find it every Thursday on Maximum Fun.
It's Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. I'm talking with Aviva Kempner. Her new movie, The Spy Behind Home Plate, is out now across the country in limited release. How did his career as an actual spy come out of his career as a player, coach, third catcher, whatever he was up to immediately upon the end of his baseball career? Or I should say, immediately upon the end of his real baseball playing career.
Right. Moe's a coach for the Red Sox when Nelson Rockefeller, who he knew, Nelson Rockefeller approached Moe about joining in an alleged trip to study and train people in baseball, players in baseball in South America. It was a total ruse because we were very worried that the Nazis were also infiltrating and gaining influence in South America, as we should have been worried. When Moe was down there, it was about the time that the OSS was being developed, the Office of Strategic Services, which was our precursor to the CIA. America was very lacking in intelligence, which was certainly proved by Pearl Harbor. And FDR had gotten Wild Bill Donovan, a hero from World War I, to develop this OSS. And Moe was like a perfect profile. Donovan loved getting people Ivy League, smart, people like Arthur Schlesinger, Ralph Bunche. But he also got safecrackers out of jail to help on it. He also got people from Hollywood like Marlene Dietrich, John Ford. By Wild Bill Donovan selecting Moe, he combined someone who had already done some missions in South America, someone who knew languages, as a child of immigrants, knew customs of what was happening in Europe. And athletes can be very agile on the spot if you have to get away, over a fence. And, you talk about Moe risking his life. He, in my mind, risked his life double, because as a Jewish male, he could be discovered on the spot. And as someone who, was written about in American newspapers, we couldn't have someone like Brad Osbos go be a spy today, because it would be all over, the digital world. It was bad enough that Moe was already in newspapers, but people wouldn't have had the access to find it. So I'd say he's like triply brave in terms of going on these missions.
I don't want to spoil any of the narrative elements of the film, but I'll say that it's very unusual to have a war hero, which he certainly was, whose greatest act of heroism was eschewing violence. He could have, look, you're giving me that look. You're doing my best not to spoil it, okay? Yeah. Let's just say Heisenberg has a son who's interviewed in the film, who was born after World War II.
Look, Moe Berg was sent on a mission to listen to Heisenberg speak. And if he figured out that Heisenberg knew about the nuclear bomb in this lecture he gave in Zurich, the orders were to kill him. And he also spoke with them after. I mean, how many people are sent on a mission to assassinate someone and they go talk to them? He made a decision that Heisenberg didn't know about the bomb. And the rest, how he did that and got away with it, you can see in the film. But I think what's really important is that how much the Manhattan Project depended on Moe's report back. Because, in fact, that was at the point crucial into developing the bomb in Los Alamos that we needed to know. And it wasn't just the Heisenberg mission. He also got Italian scientists out of Italy and to the States so they wouldn't fall into German hands and do work for them. And that was Antonio Ferri, who was a very important rocket scientist who the Germans wanted to get out. Instead, he ran and joined the partisans, and Moe found him. As someone says in the film, in one day he figured out how to find him. So it's getting the scientists out as well as finding out what their scientists knew, which is, key work. And for me, in today's world, we're worried about North Korea having nuclear capability, the Middle East, Russia. Who are the Moe Bergs of today? And I bet you anything, a lot of them are immigrants and children of immigrants who, have those language capabilities and know the customs that can fit into the background and get information back to us.
I think that background quality does feel like a particular gift of the immigrant experience, that living in two worlds simultaneously means that you have to have a certain self-awareness about your presentation, the way you exist in the world. And that certainly seems to have been a quality that Moe Berg had, that he was someone who knew what he was showing to people when he was showing something to people.
And it just wasn't Moe. We have William Corva talk about his father who led Moe into Italy, different cities to do his spying. And the father, Max Corva, had gone into the service, the son of immigrant. No, actually, he had been an immigrant himself. And they put him in as a private, and he said, but I know all these maps of Sicily. I know Italian. Use me better. And sure enough, they made him the head of the OSS. Or we have Frank Maglione, who had just been in North Africa as a soldier. They realized he knew Italian. They sent him up to Rome, and he was the radio operator that got Moe's messages back to the States. And the great mission of getting Antonio Ferra to the States that made sure that we were ahead of the Germans, FDR said, well, tell the catcher, I think he's catching pretty well still.
So when World War II ended, Moe Berg's brother, the doctor, was part of the group of doctors and scientists who traveled to Japan to study the after effects of the nuclear attack there. And we learn in the film that Moe Berg didn't know about his brother's involvement and that his brother didn't know about Moe Berg's. I mean, it's remarkable to think of the strange ways that kind of secrecy can divide even a family.
Well, Bernard Berg, before he died, had called in his sons and said, you got to do something for the war effort. Close to the day that Moe left being a coach to go spy in South America, Bernard dies. Bernard never knows what kind of spy and a war hero Moe was, and never knows either what Sam did. As a matter of fact, we have a scene in the film where Moe shows up in California. We're taping this in California to see him before he goes off for training. And Sam says, but I didn't know how Moe came on a military plane. He wasn't even telling his brother what he was in. And I have this thing about always having the Marx Brothers in my film. And sure enough, who do they have dinner with that night? But Chico Marx, who was somehow Moe's friend. I mean, that's a movie in itself. And one of the best lines at the end of the film is when Robert Kaplan says, Sam Berg never knew what Moe had done, and Moe never knew what Sam had done while the war's going on. Of course, they knew after the war. And, that happened in, I think, a lot of families. I'm the child of a Holocaust survivor, which probably is one of the biggest reasons I do my films, especially since my mother did not talk about how she passed as a Polish Catholic in Germany with another young woman with false papers working in a barrel factory. And it's these type of stories that you just sort of have to wreak out either when you're doing a film or with your own family. And one thing I always say to people is, do oral histories with your family, because I really didn't do it with my mother, even my father, who was in the military government and in the Pacific during the war. And I think what's really important is that we go back and write books, see movies, make the movies so that we know where we come from and, what constitutes a hero, what constitutes a spy. And unfortunately, because of world affairs, we're always going to need them. There are a lot of lessons to be learned by films like this.
Well, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Aviva Kempner. Her film, The Spy Behind Home Plate, is playing at theaters across the country. If you get a chance, say hi to her. She's been making appearances all the time at screenings. She is absolutely a delight of a human being. She's also, by the way, the director of one of the greatest baseball documentaries ever made, The Life and Times of Hank Greenberg, which I cannot recommend enough. That's the end of another episode of Bullseye. Bullseye is produced at MaximumFun.org World Headquarters, overlooking MacArthur Park in beautiful Los Angeles, California, where this week our producer Raghu saw horses around the lake. He thinks that police were using them. It says here in the script, Raghu says he would 100% sign up for one of those app-based scooter situations, only it's horses. Just like horses hanging out around your neighborhood. You just, rent it out. That's a free idea, America, from my producer, Raghu. The show is produced by Speaking Into Microphones. Our producer emeritus, one day to return, is Kevin Ferguson. He's taking care of a new baby, so Raghu Manavalan stepped in for him this week and came up with that horse rental situation. Jesus Ambrosio is our associate producer. We got help from Casey O'Brien. Casey is a Twins fan. Our production fellow is Jordan Cowling. She's from Philadelphia, so I'm going to say she's a Phillies fan. Raghu, what's your favorite team? Raghu is a fan of the Los Angeles Dodgers, as is Kevin Ferguson. That's just the reality of doing a public radio program in Los Angeles, is you're going to get these Dodgers fans working for you, and you can't judge them for it. You have to go into it with an open mind. I, of course, root for the San Francisco Giants. Our interstitial music is by DJ W, also known as Dan Wally. Dan Wally's from Massachusetts. I'm going to say he's a Red Sox fan. Thanks to Dan for sharing it with us. Our theme song is Huddle Formation by the Go Team. Our thanks to them and their label Memphis Industries for letting us use it. The Go Team are from England, so they probably don't know from baseball. They probably only play rounders. But let's say the folks at Memphis Industries probably root for the Memphis Redbirds. Before you go, did you know Bullseye has been around for almost 2 decades now, and all of our past shows, almost all of them anyway, are up on the internet and available to you to listen to for free. You can find them by searching our website at MaximumFun.org. You can also find many of them on our YouTube channel. Just search for Bullseye with Jesse Thorn, including this week's interviews in easily shareable fashion. All that on our website, MaximumFun.org. In your favorite podcast app. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for Bullseye with Jesse Thorn. We're on Twitter at Bullseye. I'm at Jesse Thorn. And I guess that's about it. Just remember, all great radio hosts have a signature sign-off.
Bullseye with Jesse Thorn is a production of MaximumFun.org and is distributed by NPR.